This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. With the March 29th exit date moving inexorably closer, British Prime Minister Theresa May is struggling to get the Brexit deal she negotiated with the EU through her own parliament. Politicians across the political spectrum, including many in her own party, have lined up against the agreement. A no vote would put the UK in uncharted waters, creating the prospect of a so-called hard Brexit, a departure without a deal. To help us understand this and other possible scenarios in the Brexit endgame, we're joined once again by Timothy McMahon, Associate Professor of History at Marquette University, where his research and teaching focus on national identity, imperialism, and popular culture in the UK and Ireland. An historian by training, he's also a keen observer of current events in that part of the world. Tim, welcome back.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, I think we should start out with just sort of an update. Where is this tortured Brexit process right now?
Well, the UK and the EU have been engaged in negotiations for the better part of 2 years, though it's been in fits and starts. Ultimately, they struck a deal. This is known as the withdrawal agreement. The actual trade agreement hasn't even come to the fore yet because the withdrawal had to be negotiated first. But Prime Minister May has brought this deal to the Parliament, and it's now being debated in Britain. We're in the midst of several days of negotiations and debate, and a vote is to take place on the 11th of December.
So I guess we should start with that disclaimer for our punditry here. We will probably not air until the vote has already passed, so this is all conjecture on our part. But yes. So talk a little bit about the prospects for this deal.
I'd say slim and none in terms of getting through, Doug. The Prime Minister is working with a very weak hand here. Let's just take the whole question of the content of the agreement out for a moment and recall that in the midst of the 2-year window between invoking Article 50 of the agreement with the EU, which triggers the Brexit period, and today, in that span of time, Prime Minister May called a general election. That took place in 2017. And at that point in time, her majority was actually trimmed to the point where she is reliant upon 10 votes from the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland.
So if we could just to sort of underscore that point, thinking she needed more political capital to get this deal through, she called another election hoping that the majority of the Tories in Parliament would be increased, and in fact, it was just the reverse.
It was just the reverse, exactly. You know, polling suggested that she probably would have done better going into that general election than ultimately was the case. And so she was in a weaker position, even if we were to say that every Tory and every member of the Democratic Unionist Party were to vote yes on any question that she brought before the House. But the issue here is that the Tory party itself is divided about how to approach Brexit. And this was something that Prime Minister May and her predecessor, Prime Minister David Cameron, have had to deal with. The Conservative Party, indeed the Labour Party, but let's focus on the Conservatives here. The Conservative Party has had a sort of a bifurcated approach to the EU really since Britain joined the European Union in the 1970s, what was known then as the EEC. But you've got people who believe that the EU should be transformed and that perhaps Britain should have a larger voice than it does. And then you've got people who believe that they should simply leave. And part of what Theresa May has had to do is to balance both of those factions within her government. And so since she has been prime minister, she's actually had cabinets that were made up of people from both factions. And periodically, those who were in favor of leaving have also left cabinet. And so there have been cabinet reshuffles. And bringing any agreement forward was going to be difficult because the agreement was going to be negotiated by these members of her party who were pulling in different directions. Now they have a deal on the table, and that deal is being debated, and those who wanted to leave or want a better deal are threatening to vote no.
So it's certainly been a fraught process all along, and just recently we've had something unprecedented. Government was found to be in contempt of Parliament. What was that about?
Well, part of what the members of the House of Commons wanted was as much background information on the deal and the government's reading of what the text was going to be about. And the legal opinion from the Attorney General was going to be held back. And they once the vote to be held in contempt of Parliament happened, which is almost unprecedented. I don't believe there is a precedent for it. But that contempt vote basically meant that they were going to have to release the report, which came out just the other day.
So, Brett, I saw a recent public poll. These are not members of Parliament, but the public at large, that put support for the agreement on the table at 27%, opposition at 45%, and 28% don't know.
Yes.
So that is somewhat a reflection of the original referendum as far as the don't knows after the fact, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. You know, I mean, there's one of the things that has almost become a punchline is that the morning after the original vote in 2016, the top search on Google was, what is Brexit? And the next was like, what is the EU? So the explanation for what was on the table in 2016, when the original referendum took place, was always very murky. And indeed, those who wanted to leave were not even unified. There were multiple campaigns, and they all sort of had different inflections to the things that they were emphasizing. Probably the most important was the concept of sovereignty and whether or not, in particular, England would have sovereignty. I mean, this is where you get into, from a nationalist perspective, the conflation of what is Britain, what is England. And, if you go back to that vote and you go back to the approaches that have been taken on the negotiation, you need to remember that, of course, there are 4 kingdoms that make up the United Kingdom: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And 2 of those voted to remain. 2 of those voted to leave. And within one of those, England, you had a substantial area around London that actually voted to remain also. That said, 52% voted to leave, and that's what brings us to today.
So, needed to pass 320 votes in Parliament.
Yes.
So, if you had to handicap it, how close do you think she's likely to get?
To 320?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. If she gets within 50, I'll be surprised. I really, there's enough of a split. I give the PM credit. I think she has worked diligently, but I also think that she is very limited in what she's able to bring to the table. I think she's also, not a very able campaigner. I think she's probably good within the context of the party structure itself. The fact that she has remained head of the Conservative Party throughout the last 2 years, I think is a tribute to her. It also is a measure of just how split that party is and that there are no real viable alternatives within the party.
So, as we've been talking here, I mean, the unease with this deal really is across the spectrum. So if we could just maybe a quick survey of who's unhappy with it and why.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why people are unhappy. One is that the deal as it's struck would essentially keep Britain within the confines of the EU, at least in terms of trade. And they would no longer have a say in determining trade policy, right? Because they've left the EU. This is one of the ironies of some of the discussion that's been taking place since the deal was published. Well, we'll have no voice. We won't have a say in the EU councils. That's what happens when you vote to leave. And, you know, so, you know, there is a great deal of interest among some in labor and indeed some among conservatives now in a new referendum. But among the things that also trouble a particular faction is the relationship of Northern Ireland to the rest of the United Kingdom. So, as you said earlier, the Prime Minister's party is dependent on a confidence and supply agreement with the Democratic Unionist Party. There are 10 votes from Northern Ireland that are critical to any vote that Prime Minister May brings forward. And their major concern is that Northern Ireland not be treated differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, as I said, in this agreement, all of the UK is going to fall under the umbrella of the trade relationship with the EU, but that's only for a period of time. Northern Ireland, however, because of a prior agreement between the UK and the EU, would stay associated with EU regulations beyond any point when the rest of the UK pulls out, which would mean, and this was part of that legal advice that they were trying to keep under wraps, that there would be checks between, if you will, mainland Britain and the island of Ireland. And this is something that the DUP is not in favor of.
Right, and the DUP, just to be clear, is a party in Northern Ireland that is phobic around the issue of a united Ireland.
Exactly.
They have no interest in being part of the Republic of Ireland.
Right.
So anything that smacks of even a toe in that direction is problematic.
And I mean, this is of course part of the reason why the fact that Northern Ireland would stay longer. This is why that was so important from the EU perspective. The Republic of Ireland is one of the other 27 EU states that it will remain within the EU. And they actually have a 312 mile long border with Northern Ireland. Since 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement or Belfast Agreement that ended the period known as the Troubles between the IRA and Northern Loyalist factions, as well as Unionist parties and nationalist parties in the North, what you had was an open border, and that's facilitated a growth in trade and an ease of movement across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
Well, and in fact, people transit that border multiple times in a day, right?
They do indeed. You know, I mean, there are roads literally that if you look on a map, they look like a straight line, but they actually cross the border 5 or 6 times within about a 30-mile stretch. I've seen some estimates that if you look at the number of lorry passes, trucks passing over the border in the span of a week or so, it's about 13,000. And that if you consider the movement of people and goods over the border in the course of a year, there will be something in the order of 100 million transits. I mean, it is part of daily life, and so to think that would not be possible is something that, frankly, people in Northern Ireland and people in the Irish Republic are not in favor of. And the DUP here is an outlier. Right? So they maintain that it's possible to have an open border and still have still be treated the same as the rest of the UK. But if you're going to institute checks across an international border, a border between the United Kingdom and the European Union, that's not an open border. And you know, there's a lot of discussion about technology being able to improve that situation. But how technology is used, what kind of infrastructure would be involved, none of these questions have actually been dealt with. And it seems like a pie-in-the-sky sensibility.
So apropos of all of this, there's something referred to as the backstop. So what is the backstop? The North.
So this is when I said there was a prior agreement. So what's on the table now in Parliament is what's known as the withdrawal agreement. I mean, this is what was absolutely necessary before any kind of further trade agreement between the leaving United Kingdom and the EU could actually take place.
Well, and just a bit of background there. I think the trade arrangements were something the UK was very keen to get to,
Right.
and it was the EU that said, "No, wait a minute, we're not going to talk about the carrots until we've sorted out the sticks."
Exactly,
right?
exactly. That's precisely the case. And there were three elements to it, right? One was outstanding commitments, financial commitments that the United Kingdom had made to the European Union, and those were somewhere north of 40 billion pounds. I think they negotiated the figure down to about 39 billion. Another was the treatment of EU citizens who were residents in the UK and UK citizens who were resident in the EU, what their status would be and so forth. And then the third element was this border situation with Northern Ireland. And in the process of putting together the withdrawal agreement, one element that the May government agreed to as early as a year ago was that there would always be this backstop agreement, that there would be no hard border. They reaffirmed that agreement in March of 2018. So twice over the span of the last 12 months, this has been the case. And yet here we are now with that actually incorporated in the formalized language of the withdrawal agreement. And there are people who are expressing surprise in the House of Commons that there's that there's a border, and B, that it has to be an open border.
So, assuming, as most people are predicting, the agreement fails in Parliament, what are the next steps?
Wow. Well, I mean, that's the 39 billion pound question, isn't it? I've been wrong every step of the way in any kind of prediction.
Which is why I keep having.
That's right. You keep having me back. I think the likeliest scenario is not that there's a new negotiation, but that there's a new vote. Even just as recently as the other day, the head of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, suggested that if the government is defeated, that it may not go to a new general election. Instead, there may be a new referendum on Brexit. There may be what's been called a people's vote. And I sort of think that is going to be the route forward, because the European Union has made noises about how it would be possible. They could say, if you don't want to leave, you don't have to, even after all of this. But before the United Kingdom would actually go that route, I think they would need a formal, vocal stance by the population. And that calls for another referendum or a general election. And I think the referendum is the safer bet.
So how much does the margin matter? If the agreement is just barely voted down versus it's just an apocalypse for Prime Minister May, I mean, is that, particularly with her status going forward?
Right. I think that could be, the margin could matter more to whether or not she stays head of the Conservative Party than whether or not it goes to a people's vote. I think even if it's a relatively close no vote on the withdrawal agreement, I think you're likely to see something happen electorally. The question then is Theresa May the standard bearer of the Conservative Party, or is somebody else? We've seen and heard a lot over the last few months about potential leadership challenges to her. As recently as last week, members of the European Research Group, one of the ultra-leave factions within the Conservative Party, suggested that they might try and do a leadership challenge, but they couldn't get the votes they needed within the parliamentary representation to actually hold that vote. And this is a marker, again, as I say, of Theresa May's skill within the party. If the withdrawal agreement goes down big, let us say more than that 50 or so votes that I suggested, you might see a different story. There may be a leadership challenge. But I think that may depend on whether or not you're going into a general election. I don't know whether the party would be willing to go into a general election with a prime minister who appears as weak as May would in a big vote, a big loss situation.
So are there any obvious contenders on the conservative side? I mean, who's likely to want to lead that charge?
Yeah, that's the big question. I mean, there are certainly people who have put themselves forward in terms of being outspoken Leave people. Of course, the most colorful is probably the former Foreign Minister Boris Johnson, also former Lord Mayor of London. But so much of what he has said and done has been, I'll be kind, outlandish, that I don't know how that's going to fare in an election situation. And of course, he could have stood forward against Theresa May the last time and chose not to. There's another name that has come up periodically, Michael Gove, who has been in cabinet in the past as well. I don't see him as a successful candidate either. So I honestly am not sure, but I could see both of those names being floated again. I'm going to ignore Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's yet another member of that ERG, but I don't know that he has enough support within the party to even be a viable nominee.
Well, certainly one thing that may provide a little impetus for some sort of agreement to ultimately be struck is this prospect of a breakout, basically a exit with no deal. So why is that so apocalyptic?
Well, there are a lot of reasons why. Probably the most important is that if there is no deal, immediately what happens at the end of March is that all trade relations go to WTO, World Trade Organization standard, which means that tariffs are going to be imposed across the board on trade. And when you look at the number of, for instance, those cross-border movement of goods and people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland alone, or the volume of trade between Calais and Dover, vital food, for instance, that people rely on in their daily diets in the UK, it could be quite extraordinary. And this is where too, from the EU perspective, they don't want this to happen, in part because they've got a member state in the Republic of Ireland that would be severely affected as well. I mean, I've seen some estimates, for instance, that the cost of groceries in the Republic of Ireland could go up by as much as 50% in the first year if there is that no deal scenario. And part of the reason for that is that so much of the trade, even from other EU countries, is transshipped through Britain. And immediately what you would be seeing is inspections at basically 4 sites: leaving the continent, entering Britain, leaving Britain, entering the Irish Republic. That's no good for anybody.
So, take a step back here, and I'll ask you an imponderable. Why wasn't any of this foreseen, do you think? I mean, it really seems like there's a fair amount of lack of taking this seriously until now we are fast approaching the 11th hour. So what happened?
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is, putting my historian of nationalism hat on, I really think that what we're seeing here in the Brexit vote in 2016 was an expression primarily of English nationalism, more so than anything else. The sense of lost glory, if you will, and dependence on others, which is something that was never really foreseen or acknowledged for the United Kingdom more generally, but England in particular. And as we're looking at a situation internationally where expressions of particularly hard-right nationalism have come fast and furious in the last few years, I think that the Brexit vote was an expression of that in a United Kingdom setting. What it resulted in was a lack of appreciation for so-called expertise. The experts, the financial sector, those who predicted doom and gloom, were people, frankly, who were blamed for the loss of face and the loss of status. And so if they're coming out and saying this is likely to happen, X% decline in GDP and so forth, that could be dismissed as yet another committee, yet another expert, a bit the way that climate change deniers often do in our own country.
So I'll put you on the spot yet again as we approach the 29th of March. Where do you see it going at this point?
Well, I anticipate that we'll see in the House of Commons the withdrawal agreement will be voted down. I do anticipate some sort of people's vote. I would anticipate a referendum more so than a general election, but I am perfectly willing to be shown wrong there. But I sort of think we're going to actually see a situation where the UK, with its tail between its legs, ultimately stays in the EU.
Wow, heard it here first, folks. Tim McMahon, thanks very much. We'll have you back when there's
the next on that prediction.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.